Don't the mind behind the weapon, the PTRS-41 and the designers, who turned desperation into firepower. The workshop in Tula smelled of gun oil and desperation. Sergei Gavrilovich Simonov stood before a workbench scarred by decades of failed prototypes, his hands trembling from exhaustion rather than cold. Before him lay something that shouldn't exist. A semi-automatic anti-tank rifle, 14.5 millimeters of impossible mathematics, stretched nearly 7 feet from buttstock to muzzle brake. The prototype looked brutal in the December lamplight. Steel and wood married in a configuration that violated every principle of manageable infantry weapons. Too long, too heavy, too complex for a nation whose factories were being overrun by Wehrmacht armor moving faster than Soviet high command could issue coherent orders. Outside, winter wind carried distant artillery rumble. German panzers were 300 kilometers away and closing. Inside, one man calculated whether desperation could be forged into firepower before the Reich's steel erased everything he'd spent 47 years learning about metal and survival. Simonov lifted the PTRS-41 and felt its 21 kilograms settle against his shoulder like a prayer made of iron. It was December 1941, and the Soviet Union was bleeding to death. Operation Barbarossa had torn through Soviet defenses with biblical violence. Wehrmacht tank columns, Panzer III's, Panzer IV's, rumors of heavier machines, punched through positions defended by infantry whose rifles were magnificent against flesh but worthless against sloped armor. The mathematics were brutal. A Soviet rifle division facing armor had perhaps 12 anti-tank guns, if lucky, 3 if not, sometimes none. Those guns were effective when they had time to deploy, tractors to move them, trained crews who hadn't been swallowed by encirclements at Kiev or Vyazma. But time was measured in seconds before a panzer traversed its turret and fired. What remained was improvisation born of terror. Infantrymen bundled grenades to sticks, requiring suicidal proximity. They filled bottles with gasoline, became human torches when glass shattered prematurely against tank armor. They dug pits in frozen earth and waited, hoping exhaustion would deliver mercy. High command watched entire armies vanish. 3 million men into prisoner columns stretching to Polish horizons. The doctrinal answer was supposed to be artillery, concentrated fire, massed tubes. But artillery required tractors already captured, fuel burned in retreat, trained crews learning inside encirclement rings that closed like iron fists. The State Defense Committee's autumn directive read like fantasy: design, test, and mass-produce a man-portable anti-tank rifle. Immediately, 2 men answered. Vasily Detyaryov, legendary designer, offered elegant brutality: a single-shot bolt-action rifle, fire, work the bolt, fire, simple, reliable, manufacturable by workers who'd been building tractors last month. Sergei Simonov, who had been mocked before, offered something different. He set the PTRS down and reached for the magazine. 5 rounds of 14.5 millimeter ammunition, each cartridge nearly as long as his hand. The decision to make it semi-automatic had cost 3 weeks of arguments with officials who wielded practical like a weapon. The gas piston had cracked twice. The recoil buffer shattered once, sending fragments across the workshop like shrapnel. But if it worked, if this symphony of gas operation could give 1 infantryman power to threaten 1 tank without standing to reload, then maybe doctrine could bend before reality snapped it. A young technician entered carrying test ammunition, his face grey with cold. "Comrade designer, the commission is here." The evaluation commission sat in a wooden shelter behind the factory. 3 procurement officers, 2 ordnance specialists, 1 infantry colonel, whose bandaged hand suggested recent proximity to German fire. Degtyaryov's PTRD went first. Enormous crack echoing off frozen earth. Bolt worked. Second round. Clean puncture in the Panzer III armor plate at 80 meters. The commission nodded. Adequate. Then Simonov's turn. He settled behind the PTRS, felt weight distribute across shoulder and bipod. First shot. Gas system cycled, chunk click, with mechanical certainty. Second round, third, fourth, fifth, 18 seconds. 5 rounds without breaking prone position, without exposing himself to where enemy fire would be. The colonel, with bandaged hand, examined the target holes, walked back slowly. "Comrade Designer," he said quietly, "this means I can stay behind cover." A procurement officer leaned forward. "How many factories can produce it? If the motherland gives me 3 months, you have 6 weeks. Simonov felt something crack inside his chest, not victory, just the terrible weight of impossible expectation settling onto shoulders that had carried 47 years of being right too early. That night, alone in the workshop, he held a single 14, 5mm cartridge to lamplight, watching brass catch and reflect the glow. Outside, German artillery was closer than yesterday. Inside, he had 6 weeks to turn desperation into firepower. He wondered if that was enough time to prove he wasn't insane, or if being right would kill him faster than being wrong. If stories like this make you question what you do when everyone says you're wrong but you know you're right, tell us in the comments, and stay with us for the next chapters. Sergei Simonov had been mocked before, and he carried those humiliations like scars written in blueprint ink. Born in 1894 to a blacksmith's family in Vladikavkaz, young Sergei learned metal the way other children learned language, by necessity, by bruised knuckles, by watching his father repair imperial rifles for kopecks while aristocrats' sons played with imported German toys. His father's workshop smelled of coal smoke and honesty, where measurements were absolute and mistakes were visible in bent steel. Revolution came when Sergei was 23. He watched rifles jam in Siberian cold, watched men die because firing pins snapped, learned that the distance between life and death was often just a millimeter of misaligned tolerance. After the Civil War, Simonov haunted armories like a ghost with unfinished business. He sketched mechanisms in margins, proposed improvements no one requested, stayed late adjusting prototypes that existed only in imagination until he could make them exist in steel. In 1926, he designed an automatic rifle. The commission called it overcomplicated. In 1936, he refined the concept. They chose Tokarev's SVT-40 instead. Simpler, cheaper, more doctrinal. Simonov understood the unspoken hierarchy. Brilliant mechanisms lost to practical mediocrity. Genius surrendered to the possible. But in December 1941, mediocrity had become a luxury the motherland could no longer afford. Now, with 6 weeks to deliver the impossible, Simonov spread engineering drawings across tables scarred by too many late nights. The PTRS-41 existed on paper as compromises between physics and hope. Technical challenges were staggering. A 14.5mm cartridge generated recoil that would break shoulders without proper buffering. The gas piston had to cycle fast enough to chamber the next round, but controlled enough not to tear itself apart. The magazine had to feed reliably in temperatures from summer dust to winter that froze lubricants into paste. Every part had to be manufactured in factories evacuating ahead of German advance. His chief technician, Pavel Ivanovich, entered with production estimates that read like casualty reports. 3 lathes are operational. The steel alloy requires 14 days minimum heat treatment. We don't have 14 days. Then we use faster treatments and test every barrel individually. That means half will fail proof testing. Half of something is better than all of nothing. Pavel looked at Simonov with the expression of someone watching a respected colleague walk toward a cliff. Degtyaryov's PTRD can be stamped out in any factory. Your rifle needs precision machining, specialized jigs, trained assemblers. Soldiers will choose whatever keeps them alive. What Simonov didn't say, what kept him working through nights until dawn, was simpler and more terrible. He knew the PTRD was adequate, but adequate meant soldiers died reloading between shots. The difference between semi-automatic and bolt action was measured in seconds, separating survival from iron oblivion. The irony wasn't lost on him. Degtyaryov was a genuine hero. The DP machine gun had saved countless lives. They'd met twice, shared technical discussions with mutual craftsman's respect, but respect didn't change physics. A soldier who could fire 5 rounds without breaking position had better chances than one working a bolt, while panzer machine guns searched for movement. 3 days into production planning, institutional resistance arrived. A procurement colonel visited, examined the prototype, watched demonstration firing, delivered his assessment with careful, career-protecting neutrality. The PTRD will be ready in 4 weeks. Yours will take 12. Then we work 3 times as hard. With what workers? Half our machinists are being conscripted. I'll train new ones. In 6 weeks, to precision tolerances. Simonov met the colonel's eyes and saw fear beyond bureaucratic caution. Fear of being wrong, of resources wasted, of complexity in moments demanding simplicity. Every PTRS we produce means one soldier can engage armor without standing to reload. How many lives is that worth? That depends on whether we can produce them before there are no soldiers left. He left without approving anything. That evening, walking through Tula's industrial district past triple-shift factories and evacuation notices, Simonov thought about his childhood, the satisfying precision of watching metal obey mathematics. He thought about the Civil War, about good men dying because weapons failed. He thought about what it meant to be right when everyone called you impractical. And he thought about the terrible possibility that they might all be correct, that complexity might be luxury, that his obsession might be nothing more than engineer's pride refusing to accept that adequate was enough. But then he remembered the colonel's bandaged hand, remembered the sound of the gas system cycling with mechanical certainty that said, "This works, this keeps working when staying alive depends on it." Back in the workshop, Pavel was adjusting barrel tolerances by lamplight. "I thought you went home. Home is 20 kilometers. Panzers are 300, but moving closer. Mathematics says I should stay." Simonov felt determination born from understanding that being right meant nothing unless you could prove it to people who'd stopped believing proof mattered. "How many barrels can we proof test tomorrow?" 8, if none crack. "Then let's pray to mathematics that 8 is enough to start." Production began in chaos measured by air raid sirens. Tula's factories operated under conditions that would have been called impossible if impossibility hadn't already become routine. Workers assembled rifles while German shells whistled overhead, not close enough to kill, but close enough to remind everyone that close was a shrinking distance. The first week, Simonov slept 4 hours total. Every prototype component demanded inspection. Every tolerance required verification. Every assembly sequence needed documentation. His hands developed tremors from exhaustion and the knowledge that mistakes in mathematics became casualties in metal. The buffer system cracked during the 3rd proof test. Massive 14.5mm recoil had to be absorbed by springs compressed into space, limited by what a man could carry. Too soft, the bolt would batter itself to pieces. Too hard, the shooter's shoulder would break. Pavel found him at 3 in the morning examining the stress fracture with a jeweler's loop. "The metallurgy is wrong. We're using automotive spring steel because ordnance steel is allocated to artillery. Then we increase diameter and reduce compression rate. That adds 800 grams. 800 grams is better than a rifle that breaks after 20 rounds." They redesigned the buffer by lamplight, calculating spring constants, while anti-aircraft batteries fired at German reconnaissance planes that appeared each dawn like clockwork. The magazine presented different nightmares. 5 rounds of 14.5 meters ammunition in a reliable feeding system, small enough for prone soldiers to reload under fire. The rounds were enormous, nearly 6 inches long, thick as a man's thumb. The first magazine jammed after 3 rounds, feed lips bent. Follower spring compressed unevenly. Simonov spent 2 days filing feed angles by hand, testing spring tensions, discovering that the difference between reliable and useless was 0.2 of a millimeter. His wife's letter arrived via evacuating neighbor. She didn't ask when he was coming home. She asked if he was eating, sleeping, if he remembered they'd planned to visit her sister before the world ended. He didn't reply. Admitting he cared would crack open the compartment where he'd locked away everything except metal, mathematics, and terrible clarity of purpose. By late January, they had 15 working prototypes, hand-fitted mechanisms that existed between concept and reality, each with quirks and personalities. The procurement commission returned with Sergeant Dmitri, pulled from the Mojaisk defensive line for testing. 23 years old, looked 40. He'd seen panzers at 70 meters, close enough to count rivets, too close to do anything except die or hide. Dmitri picked up the PTRS with careful respect soldiers reserve for untrusted equipment. 5 rounds, Simonov explained. Semi-automatic, gas system cycles automatically. How reliable? We've tested 200 rounds per prototype. 3 stoppages total. How many stoppages does it take to die? 1. Dmitri nodded. Honesty was currency soldiers understood. He settled into firing position. First shot, gas system cycled, chunk click with mechanical certainty. Second, third, fourth, 5th rounds, 18 seconds, never breaking prone position. He stood slowly, looked at Simonov with eyes that had seen too much to pretend enthusiasm but couldn't quite hide relief. Comrade designer, this means I can stay behind cover. The skeptical procurement colonel leaned forward. And the PTRD? PTRD works. 1 shot, work the bolt. Takes 30 seconds for 5 rounds, sitting up each time. Every time you sit up, someone's looking for you. So you prefer the PTRS? Dmitri's expression carried complicated mathematics of honesty, conflicting with politics. I prefer staying alive. Whichever rifle does that is the one I want. The colonel turned to Simonov. Your production timeline? 6 weeks for 200 rifles, assuming no evacuations, no material shortages, no bombing. Degtyaryov can deliver 800 in the same time. Then deliver both. Let soldiers choose. The words came out sharper than intended, carrying weeks of frustration. We don't equip the Red Army by committee. We equip by doctrine. Doctrine said cavalry could stop tanks. How did that work? Silence. The commission left without approving expanded production. They took Dmitri back to Mojaisk, back to fighting panzers with whatever doctrine deemed appropriate. Simonov never learned if the sergeant survived winter. Mathematics suggested probably not. That night, sitting with cold tea and blurred technical drawings, Simonov felt the weight of every choice since December. The rifle worked. Mathematics were sound. Soldiers understood immediately what semi-automatic operation meant in seconds, separating breathing from not. But doctrine moved slower than reality. Committees required proof beyond physics. Certainty was luxury no one could afford when German tanks advanced faster than Soviet industry could retreat. Pavel sat across from him, cleaning test rifles with meditative focus. You were right about the buffer system. Being right and being believed are different problems. Yes, and we can only solve one of them. Do you think you'd fight the system for what you believe works, or accept what doctrine says is impossible? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real innovation stories from history. How long can you fight for something when everyone says you're wrong? February brought production and problems in equal measure. The State Defense Committee, overruling procurement objections, issued Solomon's judgment. Approve both rifles. Let tactical necessity determine which design served best. Every platoon would receive both, Degtyaryov's simple PTRD and Simonov's complex PTRS, competing not in committee rooms but in frozen fields where competition meant survival rates. It wasn't victory. It was coexistence, bureaucratic compromise, acknowledging neither was completely right, but both might be partially useful. Simonov accepted it like battlefield medicine, grateful it exists, aware it's not healing. Tula's factories expanded PTRS production under chaos that made earlier disorder look organized. Workers assembled rifles while German artillery struck rail yards 3 kilometers away. Quality control became prayer with gauges. Critical dies cracked. Replacement tooling required materials allocated elsewhere, authorization from committees evacuating to cities that might not exist next month. The buffer system still cracked on every 10th rifle. Pavel organized secondary inspection, where failed components were melted, recast. The waste was staggering, but waste was relative when measured against Wehrmacht panzers wasting entire divisions in afternoon offensives. The gas port fouled after sustained firing. Carbon buildup choked the system, turned semi-automatic into manual operation, requiring soldier disassembly under battlefield conditions. Simonov adjusted port diameter, calculated new gas pressures, tested until his hands were permanently black with residue. By late February, the first 200 production PTRS-41 rifles shipped to front units and arrived with steel core ammunition. The mistake was understandable in catastrophic logistics. Tungsten core armor-piercing ammunition was reserved for anti-tank guns. The 14 5mm steel core rounds could kill infantry at 1,000 meters, damage light vehicles, make impressive holes in test targets. But against sloped panzer armor, harmless. Spectacular sparks, zero tactical effect except alerting crews that someone needed killing with high-explosive shells. After-action reports came back within a week. Unit commanders requested clarification. Were these expensive paperweights or actual anti-tank rifles? Simonov spent 3 sleepless nights recalculating whether steel core rounds might achieve penetration. Mathematics said no. Physics said no. Reality said soldiers were dying because procurement sent right weapons with wrong bullets. Then something unexpected happened. A lieutenant near Kaluga, desperate and furious, loaded captured German armor-piercing ammunition into a PTRS magazine. The rounds were slightly different. Tighter tolerances, marginal variations that should have caused jamming or catastrophic failure. They fit, barely. First test cracked the chamber slightly. Second test worked perfectly. Third through 10th proved that engineering tolerances were sometimes more flexible than engineers admitted when survival demanded flexibility. The lieutenant's report filtered up with bureaucratic velocity of information, contradicting official specifications. Someone marked it unverified field modification, not authorized. Someone else copied it to multiple design bureaus. Someone in Stavka understood that desperate solutions were still solutions. Word spread through frontline units faster than official communications. If you captured German ammunition, if caliber was close enough, if you were willing to risk chamber cracks, the PTRS could achieve penetration doctrine said was impossible. It was improvisation. It was dangerous. It was absolutely not what procurement intended. It worked. By March, Soviet factories produced proper tungsten core 14.5mm armor-piercing ammunition. First batches arrived with delivery notes that read like vindication, for use with PTRS-41 and PTRD-41 anti-tank rifles against armored targets. But something had shifted in Simonov's understanding of what he'd created. Pavel spread after-action reports across the workbench, field reports describing actual combat use. The rifle can't kill Tigers, can't penetrate Panther frontal armor, even Panzer IVs with spaced plating resist. Simonov felt something cold settle. So it doesn't work. No, Pavel said quietly, it works, just not the way we thought. He pointed to a Rzev report. 2-man PTRS team held a road junction 6 hours. Fired over 300 rounds, engaged 11 panzers, didn't destroy a single tank, but damaged all 11 enough to force withdrawal. Rounds through observation ports blinded gunners, shots to engine decks sparked fires, hits to fuel lines, vision blocks, external stowage. Each impact transformed 40-ton machines into something vulnerable. They stopped all 11 panzers, didn't kill them, made them retreat. One PTRS team. 6 hours. When relief arrived, one rifleman was dead, the other permanently deaf. The PTRS barrel glowed cherry red. And the road stayed open. 3 rifle companies crossed that junction. Because 2 men with 1 PTRS convinced 11 panzer crews that advancing wasn't worth the risk. Similar patterns emerged from other reports. PTRS teams weren't tank killers, they were tank wounders. Tank psychology delivered through 14mm apertures that forced German crews to button up, restricted visibility, made them reconsider charging across open ground. It wasn't what doctrine wanted. It wasn't what specifications promised. It was what desperation and physics negotiated when neither would surrender. That night, Simonov walked through Tula's streets, past factories that never stopped, past workers heading to triple shifts, past children playing in snow that would melt into spring offensive mud. He thought about inventing something that worked, but not the way intended, about gaps between engineering specifications and battlefield reality. And he wondered if being right in an unexpected way still counted as being right, or if that was just another name for failure you learned to live with. January 1942. Moscow had not fallen. Stalin himself reviewed the competing anti-tank rifles in a room stripped of ceremony, just tables, weapons, and men whose decisions measured consequences in divisions. Stalin picked up the PTRS, hefted its 21 kilograms deliberately. This weighs as much as 2 conscripts' ammunition loads. Simonov's heart stopped. Good, Stalin continued. Every platoon gets both. Let soldiers choose, not victory, coexistence. Production accelerated. By February, over 15,000 anti-tank rifles reached front units, roughly equal PTRS and PTRD, distributed by local commander preference. Ammunition flowed more reliably now, proper tungsten core rounds that could penetrate 40mm of vertical armor. The rifles arrived as Wehrmacht prepared spring offensives designed to finish what winter interrupted. Doctrine said anti-tank rifles were already obsolete. German armor had evolved. Thicker frontal plates, improved sloping, spaced armor defeating kinetic penetrators. Tiger frontal armor was impervious to 14.5mm rounds at any practical range. Doctrine was wrong, not because it misunderstood armor physics. That was accurate. Wrong because doctrine measured effectiveness only by kills, not influence. The PTRS couldn't destroy a Tiger, but it could wound one. A round through observation port blinded gunners. A shot to engine deck sparked fires that might consume the compartment. Uncertainty forcing crew attention from target acquisition to damage assessment. After-action reports documented new mathematics. PTRS units engaged armor at 30 to 300 meters, beyond grenade range, close enough that rifle fire could find weak points. Near Rzhev, a 2-man PTRS team wrote themselves into tactical history. Corporal Alexei Volkov and Private Ivan Chernyshev occupied a collapsed barn overlooking a road junction German armor needed. The engagement lasted 6 hours. 11 panzers attempted to force the junction. Volkov and Chernyshev fired over 300 rounds, systematically targeting vision ports, engine decks, external stowage, track assemblies. They destroyed nothing, disabled nothing, killed no one. But they damaged all 11 enough to force withdrawal. Commanders calculated that accumulating minor damage under sustained fire was tactically foolish. They pulled back, requested infantry support, called for artillery. By the time German infantry methodically cleared the barn, they found 1 dead Soviet soldier, 1 permanently deaf survivor, a warped PTRS barrel, and a road junction that 3 Soviet rifle companies had crossed while Germans regrouped. Brutal, simple mathematics. 2 men with 1 rifle influenced 11 tanks for 6 hours. The exchange ratio looked very different when measured in kilometers held and soldiers saved. German intelligence captured a PTRS in April, produced dismissive evaluation, over-engineered Soviet desperation weapon. Excessive weight makes practical deployment questionable. tactical utility limited against modern armor. They were right about everything except what mattered. It was desperation, it was over-engineered, and it worked. Not as the tank killer Simonov envisioned. It worked as something stranger, a weapon giving infantry agency against armor. The psychological shift was enormous. Soldiers who previously could only hide or die now had a third option: engage. Even when engagement meant damage rather than destruction, when best outcome was forcing tanks to reconsider, that shift from passive to active defense changed infantry morale in ways procurement never anticipated. By summer 1942, over 190,000 PTRS and PTRD rifles were in Soviet hands, largest anti-tank rifle deployment in history. They didn't stop blitzkrieg, but they made it bleed. They forced panzer commanders to think twice before charging unsupported. They gave infantry something between hope and firepower, which proved more valuable than either alone. Simonov watched from Tula's design bureau, reading reports, reviewing field modifications. The rifle had evolved beyond his vision. Soldiers removed muzzle brakes to reduce signature, fabricated custom bipods, developed loading techniques, increasing sustained fire rates. The weapon he designed was becoming what soldiers needed, shaped by battlefield pragmatism he couldn't have anticipated. Pavel found him reviewing a Kursk report where PTRS teams engaged new Tigers. The report described a Tiger advancing through defensive positions, systematically destroying everything. A PTRS team, 3 soldiers, 2 rifles, engaged from 90 meters, 0 penetrations. Tiger armor defeated every round, but cumulative impact of 12-14. 12mm projectiles hitting observation ports blinded the crew enough that they stopped advancing, reversed to reassess, withdrew to clear damaged optics. That pause allowed Soviet infantry to reposition, anti-tank guns to relocate, defensive lines to hold 6 more hours until nightfall ended fighting. "We didn't build a tank killer," Pavel observed. "We built a tank botherer." Simonov laughed, short, tired, genuine. "That might be the most honest tactical assessment I've heard." "Is it enough? Being right in a way you didn't expect?" Simonov looked at the prototype still on the workbench, scarred by testing and soldiers who understood its utility better than its designer. "It has to be, because it's all we have. What does it mean to invent something that works, just not the way you planned?" The war ended. The Soviet Union endured. Mathematics of survival proved more resilient than Wehrmacht armor. By 1945, over 190,000 PTRS-41 and PTRD-41 rifles had been manufactured, carried from Moscow to Berlin, fired millions of times. The rifles performed exactly as battlefield reality required, not as tank killers, but as infantry force multipliers, transforming helpless soldiers into soldiers with options. They'd wounded thousands of tanks, disabled hundreds, destroyed dozens through accumulated damage, and, most importantly, changed how armor operated near Soviet defensive positions. German commanders learned to avoid areas where anti-tank rifles operated without infantry support. Panzer crews learned to keep vision blocks closed longer, move faster through danger zones. The rifles created negative space where armor's freedom of movement was constrained not by what rifles could do, but by what commanders feared they might do. Odd victory, succeeding through threat more than execution. Psychological influence more than kinetic destruction. Procurement never understood this. Tactical analysts struggled to quantify it, but soldiers who'd used PTRS rifles knew exactly what they'd gained: ability to fight back when doctrine said fighting was futile. Then, abruptly, the rifles vanished from doctrine. Post-war Soviet military theory evolved toward combined arms, mechanized warfare, atomic battlefield considerations. Anti-tank rifles were declared obsolete, replaced by RPGs, recoilless rifles, wire-guided missiles that could reliably defeat armor rather than inconvenience it. The rifles were collected, stored in warehouses. Some went to museums. Most went to forgotten inventory depots where military equipment waits for wars that may never come. Vasily Degtyaryov died in 1949, celebrated. History remembered him as hero of Soviet engineering. Sergei Gavrilovich Simonov continued designing weapons, improved carbines, modified rifles, technical refinements. His SKS carbine became standard issue, then was replaced by Kalashnikov's AK-47, another case of adequate defeating optimal. He was decorated, given awards, granted comfortable retirement, but he remained obscure, overshadowed by designers whose weapons fit doctrine better, whose names became synonymous with Soviet military achievement. Simonov never spoke publicly about December 1941, about standing in freezing Tula workshop holding impossible dreams while a nation collapsed. Never discussed the gap between what he'd hoped to create and what reality needed. Never revealed whether he considered the PTRS-41 success or compromise. But soldiers remembered. Veterans of Kursk, Stalingrad, Berlin, they remembered the weight, the brutal recoil, the distinctive gas system sound. They remembered making impossible choices about which rifle to carry, based on terrain, expected ranges, tactical intuition about what next hours might demand. They remembered that when doctrine failed, when strategy collapsed, Simonov had given them a chance. Not guarantee, not even good odds, just a chance, ability to engage rather than hide. In military memoirs and veteran reunions, in quiet conversations between old men comparing scars, the PTRS-41 lived on as the weapon that shouldn't have worked but did, in ways mattering more than procurement acknowledged. Simonov died in 1986, 82 years old, quietly comfortable in obscurity. Then something strange happened. In 2014, footage emerged from eastern Ukraine showing conflict echoing older wars. Among visible weapons, a PTRS-41, 73 years old, still firing, still dangerous, still refusing obsolescence despite every rational calculation saying its tactical relevance expired decades earlier. The rifle looked ancient, worn, modified, maintained through improvisation, but that distinctive profile was unmistakable: long barrel, massive receiver, characteristic bipod. It was firing at armored vehicles, not killing them. Modern armor made penetration even less likely than 1942, but suppressing them, forcing caution, creating that same negative space where armor's freedom became constrained by psychological pressure from weapons that shouldn't still exist. Tactical mathematics hadn't changed. Desperation plus physics plus refusal to accept impossibility still equaled something that worked just enough to matter. Military analysts wrote articles. Defense journalists published think pieces about unexpected longevity. Historical researchers revisited Simonov's biography, discovering details about the man whose weapon outlived him by generations. But deeper truth remained what it always was. Sergei Simonov hadn't built the weapon doctrine wanted. He'd built what soldiers needed, even though he couldn't predict what that need would look like, filtered through battlefield reality's brutal pragmatism. He'd done this while being mocked, doubted, forced to share credit, watching his innovation coexist with simpler solutions, seeing his weapon declared obsolete, knowing history would remember other designers more clearly. Yet 73 years later, on battlefields he never imagined, soldiers still chose to carry 21 kilograms he'd designed in December 1941, when desperation was the only doctrine that mattered. In the end, it wasn't the weapon that endured. Steel eventually breaks. It wasn't specifications or innovations or gas-operated actions that made committees nervous. What endured was refusal to surrender to the impossible. Understanding that sometimes survival doesn't come from choosing between practical and perfect, simple and complex, doctrine and reality. Sometimes it comes from forging both side by side, letting desperate people decide which keeps them alive. Simonov gave soldiers that choice, not because he was wiser or more talented, Because he'd been willing to work through 6 weeks of night when committees said there wasn't time for ambition. Because he understood that being right before anyone believed you was the hardest victory, and being partially right in unexpected ways was still worth the cost of sleepless mathematics and workshop obsession. History calls the PTRS-41 a stopgap, interim solution, weapon born from desperation. They're right. It was desperation, measured, calculated, machined to 10th millimeter tolerances, fired over 1 million times into war's heart. Then something stranger, a weapon that outlived its designer, doctrine, obsolescence, carried forward by soldiers across generations who understood that sometimes the most practical weapon refuses to become impractical just because doctrine says it should. The PTRS-41 still exists, in museums, collections, forgotten armories. On battlefields, proving obsolescence is bureaucratic category, not physical law. And somewhere in that persistence echoes Sergei Simonov, standing in Tula workshop December 1941, hands on cold metal, refusing to accept that complexity and desperation couldn't be forged into something giving soldiers a chance. That was enough. That had to be enough. That was everything. If this story reminded you that changing the world often means being right before anyone believes you, subscribe to the channel. Tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. If you invented something that changed war, would that be victory or burden?